Now, as we get set to continue our trek heading towards the land of wood and water, Jamaica, I'm sure you would have collected your boarding passes, but we have some lovely in-flight conversation as we welcome the next speaker as we talk about the future of telecom regulations in the wake of the pandemic. Our next speaker, Dr. Mark Jameson, is the director and Gerald Gunter Professor of the Public Utility Research Center and director of the Digital Markets Initiative at the University of Florida. He provides research and international training on business and government policy, focusing primarily on information technology, antitrust, technology development and adoption, and regulation. He is also a non-resident senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. To facilitate the discussion, let's welcome back no stranger to today's spotlight on day one, our chairman, Mr. David Cox.
Thank you very much, Wendell. I really appreciate the introduction. And Dr. J, Dr. Mark Jameson, it's a real pleasure to see you, and thank you so much for making the time to do this, to have this conversation. Welcome.
Well, the pleasure and honor is all mine, David. You've been a great friend for a long time, and all of our friends in the Caribbean. You folks have been world leaders in many issues, especially in telecommunications and regulations. So it's just an honor to me and for my colleagues to be part of that.
Thank you, Mark. That's one of your great qualities, which is incredible humility. You're a world-renowned expert in economics and in regulation, and we're incredibly chuffed that you give us some of your time. We know how busy you are. You know, Mark, a little over a year ago, I recall that you reached out and you said something to me that was really interesting, and it's never left me since. You said, these are really unprecedented times. Nobody's in living memory has been through what we're going through now. And there aren't any best practices. There are just what to do next. It's basically coping the best you can. I want to, by the way, if you see me, averting my eyes from time to time or not making direct eye contact, it's because I'm, reviewing a few notes. But I wanted to start our conversation by talking to you about, the impact of the pandemic on the telecoms industry. And the first thing I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on is looking back now. Are there any best practices that emerged? Did you see any? You have connections with regulators across the globe. Did there appear to you to be any decisions or actions that were taken either on a regulatory point or otherwise, or even in companies themselves, where you figured, given the circumstances, this was about as best as could be done?
Oh, sure. And thank you again, David. There are a lot of things I think we've learned along the way. And the what I'd call the best practices are more kind of general ideas. But let me talk just a little bit about how we got through and learned those things. So if we go back, about 16 or so months ago, when we all first learned that we were going to be in lockdown, if you remember how you felt, we didn't know what to do. If anybody thought they knew what to do, they were completely wrong. And it was just as you said, there was just no path to follow. And then there's probably a lot of times for you and your audience, and for me certainly, along the way, where we kind of shook our heads and said, I'm just blowing it. I'm just doing all these things wrong. But now look around this room. It's a virtual room, but there's a lot of people that are here. And you see who's here and look at all the things that have been accomplished. All of you provided the leadership that got your countries through as far as we've gone and for where we need to go next. And I think it's really good to just allow ourselves to appreciate that, everything that's been accomplished in that. All of us would have liked for things to have gone better. We would have loved for everyone to have had all the broadband they wanted. But that just wasn't going to be possible. Because if we'd had more resources, more people devoted to broadband over this time, there have been fewer people, fewer resources devoted to supply chains for food or supply chains for education or for healthcare or for a whole host of other things. They're just trade-offs that everyone had to make. And maybe we could have done them better, but I would be surprised given everything that we did not know, and we did not know what was coming. And I think that really tells us then what those best practices really looked like. One of the things that I think was really key to getting us to where we are today, and that's going to make us even better, because that's now our challenge. We can feel pretty good about what we've accomplished, but now the question is, how are we going to be better? How are we going to make sure that we actually improve what we are delivering to people? One of those is to embrace that adaptability. People were impressively adaptable. Think about most of you in the audience have people that work for you. And so you found yourself 16 months ago in a situation where you wanted to really protect your customers. They depend upon you. In this case, they depended upon you more than ever before. But so did your employees. They depended upon you more than ever before. And you couldn't take complete care of both of them at the same time. That was a really difficult trade-off, and you had to learn and make a decision and adapt and learn some more and adapt. And that's just key for how we made it through this situation. But if you just put that in the context of this industry, we're always adapting. Just that this was a surge of adaptation that we had just not experienced before. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. We need to have an incredibly adaptive system. So the systems that performed well around the world, and I've had the opportunities to talk with people from a lot of different countries, were the ones where people did not try to embrace a command and control approach. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more in just a minute. But instead said, we need latitude. We need to give people opportunities to make their own decisions as much as they can. And that's why we have markets rather than just kind of a top-down dictation of what's going to happen. If you look at broadband around the Caribbean, the countries that perform the worst are the ones with the most tight control over telecommunications or any other part of the economy. It's the ones where we allow markets because they're so information rich and they have so much of the right incentives for getting things done well. That's the adaptability we want. We want to make sure we hang on to those because there's pressure to not hang on to markets and competition and allowing customers to make decisions, operators to make decisions, and the government to play its role, providing the framework for all those decisions to be made in. I think another lesson is that we all want the same thing, that we really had very successful cooperative relationships through this. Now, each of us is in our different roles, but I think, well, one of the things that struck me is that as I talk with people in ministries, talk to CEOs, talk to academics, consumers, everyone, they all wanted the very same thing. And I think that was probably already true, but maybe we didn't quite appreciate it. I think if we had, instead of having a pandemic, had gotten together the head of the people from the head of government, the top people in the different companies, the consumers, put them all on stage in public and had them talk about what is the consumer experience we really aspired people to have in the Caribbean. What do we really want for our country in terms of this ICT infrastructure? They probably would have all basically agreed. Even though we fight over things, we all agree upon where we're wanting to go. And so we've learned, I think, very clearly that is true. And all we're talking about and debating is how do we actually get there? And what are the different roles that we'll all play in that? And that takes me then to the third lesson. And this is a general lesson of leadership in any kind of difficult situation. I think all of you noticed that when the world became very uncertain, the people in your countries looked to their leaders to provide them with certainty. Now, the leaders had no more idea of what should be done than anybody else did. But our natural instinct is to look to our leaders and say, provide me with certainty. Give me answers as to what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. If you're in a leadership role, it's very tempting to grab that and say, yes, I will provide answers. But we didn't really have answers. The best thing we could do was help the consumers have what confidence they could have that the system was going to work and that they could make decisions in their own best benefit, and that the leaders were going to resist trying to take a command and control approach. That instead people were going to say, well, we have the operators know all their different issues in technology and finance. The consumers know their financial issues, what their needs are. The policymakers know what the frameworks are. And so how do we let this system work and learn? And I think that's one of the real keys here is that, well, there's we'll walk back through all three of those. I think the key lessons are we want an adaptive system, which means we want a system that's relying upon very information-rich markets with a lot of incentives to do things that are good for everybody that's involved. We want a cooperative relationship where we've agreed upon what we are trying to accomplish, still playing our individual roles, but then also understand that we need to resist that temptation to provide something that would actually be the wrong thing to provide, even though it may look good in the short run.
And we need leadership. Mark, that I'm really those are really interesting comments, because in a very direct way, you touched on, I think, the core of the conversation that's happening in the Caribbean and Latin America and probably all around the world about the role of the telecoms industry, the results that everyone is looking for ICTs and telecoms to deliver, and as well you've touched on some of the clues about how we get there. And I was particularly touched by the comment you made about collaboration and avoiding command and control approaches. And I wanted to dig into that with you a little bit. Mm-hmm. We learned that as you said, the industry has been incredibly adaptable. We're talking about companies which had to have most of their operations put online, sometimes within the space of a few days. Telecoms companies, I can speaking for my own company, Cable and Wireless, we had literally a few days in which we had to create the capacity for something like 80 or 90% of our employees to work from home. And we were able to do it successfully, but that took some doing. And other companies, in the Caribbean elsewhere had to make similar adjustments. So I think your point on adaptability is very well taken. But I do want to ask about this, I want to ask about the reaction to the problems that the pandemic highlighted. And your comments on collaboration, I think, are interesting. I want to know, from your point of view, what are some of the things that you think governments, what may be some of the mistakes, or what are the wrong conclusions that governments may be drawing from this experience? And what are some of the dangers at a policy level that you think we could be looking at as a result of the pandemic?
Sure. And I can use my own country as the case in point for everything that you just talked about. I don't know how many of you ever pay attention to the politics and the policies in the United States. If you do, you have my complete sympathy. It's painful enough for me. I have to live here. If you're paying attention to it as well, you don't have to, so I'm not sure why you do. But right now, I'm sitting in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., And just down the street from me, people in Congress are trying to figure out how they're going to use taxpayer money for infrastructure. And part of the deal right now is about $65 billion that would be for broadband. And this is the kind of reaction you get because they sincerely believe, and their hearts are in the right places, all of your hearts are in the right places, that students need this in order to be able to study from home, that workers need this in order to be able to work from home. Absolutely, that's a completely fair conclusion. And so the reaction is, let's just provide the money and go do it. And how they're thinking about it, they're thinking about it in terms of, well, maybe the government will become a broadband provider. So some of that money is going to go to local governments, state governments to start becoming a broadband provider. Or we're going to just have some very specific kinds of public-private partnerships that could get problematic. Now, those can go well, but if you're doing it in a place where there's also competition, you're going to tilt the market badly. So let me just talk about the public ownership issue. It sounds great on paper. And in fact, I used to live in Gainesville, Florida. I now live outside of there, but that's where the University of Florida is. Our local utility is city-owned and does provide some broadband, not on a retail basis. Only if an internet service provider is unable to provide service somewhere, then the city will say, okay, we'll run the fiber optics for you. So they will do that. So I'm not saying that the government never has a role in this. I'm saying we just need to be very, very careful. Because one of the things we've learned in telecommunications is that when the government tries to become the service provider, that the expansion of the industry actually slows down and the cost to the industry actually goes up. So there's a piece of research, I wrote a piece on this a few years ago. All the research tends to say that. I used numbers from one particular piece of research from Scott Walston. Scott is the president of the Technology Policy Institute here in DC. And he looked at the Caribbean and Latin America and said, when we went through privatizations and open markets to competition, how much did that change the growth rate of telecommunications? And if you applied his numbers today, you would find that the growth rate under government ownership as opposed to private ownership was about, I think it's a third less. So if let's apply that in this situation. Different countries have different amounts of broadband penetration in the Caribbean. But if you take where you are today and you say, I'm at 15% penetration, I'm at 30% penetration, I want to double that in 5 years. If you choose to have the government play the role of the infrastructure provider, you will miss that mark by 20% just because of the difference in performance. And this is other research, and this is something Ted Curry, our director of energy studies, and I took on a few years ago, answering this question for the state of Florida, should it become a broadband provider? He said, well, if you do, customers will have to pay 10% more. And that's just the way our research was. Now, it's not to say that government people are incompetent, because the government could just simply go hire a lot of smart guys like David Cox and the people who work for cable and wireless, or the people who work for Digicel. These are all really smart people. They're very good at their work. It's just that the government institutions aren't designed to do this. So when you have a private institution, its incentive is to listen very carefully to the customers about broadband, not about everything else, just about broadband. And say, okay, how much is this broadband really worth to you? Okay, that helps us know what the price is, what the value is to you, how much we can spend to provide it. We have to work with the employees and say, all right, what are your lives like? What are your futures like? How do you want this all to work? We have to work with the financial community and say, you have opportunity costs for money all around the world. What do you need? And the private sector has the right incentives and all that information from the markets to put together its ideas about what it should do. And if there's multiple companies doing this, then you have competing ideas, and you get the kind of growth rate that could get you doubled in 5 years if you get all the incentives and such in the right place, and the economics can do that. Government institutions just behave differently than that. And those of you that have worked in government, or maybe still do, you know what I'm talking about. You know that at the end of the day, it's the politics of the situation that drives decisions. Now, that's not to say politicians are wrong or they're bad. It's just saying that when they feel pressure, their pressure is what's going to happen to me in the next election. That's what we want them to do. We want them to always be worried about that, because they're the people who have to say, we're going to emphasize education right now. We're going to emphasize investments in healthcare right now. We're going to emphasize whatever else there might be. And in that world, the world that they live in, they are always tempted to say, yeah, we really ought to put some more money into that fiber optics, but maybe next year, because I really need to hire more teachers this year, or I really want to keep taxes down this year. And so their incentive system, their institutional system for making decisions is just the wrong one for doing this kind of work. And so if we go down the road, which is part of what very well will probably happen in the US, so the thing I'm talking about right now, or working on right now, is how do we set up an accountability system so we can avoid as much of these problems as we can. If you go down the public ownership road, you won't reach your goal fast, and it will cost more money. Not because anybody is a bad person, not because anyone is uninformed or ignorant. It's just the institutional incentives and the ways that information flow through markets versus through a government system are just different, and they get different results because of that.
Mark, I think you really explained very well that, you know, the tension at the heart of this, you know, conversation. And I completely agree with you. This is not about bashing government or, you know, suggesting that governments aren't qualified to do, you know, certain things, or it's just simply about pointing out that, as you rightly said, there's some things just government aren't very well designed to do, and there's some things that they are. You know, we in the last year, the governments around the world have done a fantastic job in some places of ensuring that vaccines could be developed in very short periods of time and get approved in a very short period of time. And frankly, those are the sorts of things governments can do well when they're well managed. But you're absolutely right that all of the evidence that we've seen from around the world proves that governments just don't run businesses very well, and that's the issue. And so I think you've explained that really well, and it does sort of, you know, highlight for me the challenge, I think, in the Caribbean and Latin America, because I do want to throw it back to you that, look, at the end of the day, and I'm being devil's advocate here, we had this huge pandemic, and governments in developing countries are seeing that there were children in communities without connectivity, without laptops, and they're saying, we can't let this happen again. And this is throughout Caribbean and Latin America, and poverty rates are skyrocketing. So there's a temptation on the parts of some of these governments. They're saying, you know what, we can't rely on the private sector anymore. We can't rely on these telecoms companies, which are motivated by profit, to deliver what we think is an essential service and a human right. So we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to spend the money to build networks. We're going to invest in, you know, creating companies to manage these networks, although we have no experience and no people, you know, no internal resources to do that. And I would ask you, if a minister of telecoms or a prime minister from the Caribbean were to say to you, we just feel this is absolutely necessary because the situation is critical for me in this part of the world. You know, you've answered some of it, but I would say, imagine you were talking to him or her. What would you say to that person?
That's a tough one, and because I'm in that situation here in the United States, when I talk with my friends in state government, they're all excited that they sincerely believe the federal government's going to give them money, and then they're going to go forth and do good. And I have to tell them that, yeah, you'll try really hard, but at the end of the day, you won't be able to get that done. And so I point to the examples back in the early part of the Obama administration. The federal government put, I think it was about $8 billion into exactly the same system that they're going to put the $65 billion into. Well, part of the $65 billion, I don't know how much of it, maybe $30 billion of it or so. They're going to put in the same system. They spent about $8 billion in. And some friends of mine did a study that looked at how much did broadband expand. Now, all $8 billion was spent, and they built stuff and they paid people salaries, no doubt about that. But the question was, did the amount of broadband expand? And the answer is no. All they did, at best, was replace some of the investment that the private sector would have made anyway. And then there's the situation we had in Florida. I met with the gentleman. They had this great big project that they were very proud of. And the federal government was very proud of it as well. This was going to do great things for a rural area that had no service, except when I talked with the guys that had the money. And I said, so you're going to be putting service in this area that has no fiber optics or anything? They said, oh, no. Yeah, I said, that's what we said we would do. But we're going to go over there and compete with Verizon, because where there's no fiber optics, there are also no customers. These people don't have money. We're going over there. We're going to compete with the private sector. And that is what will happen here in the U.S. as well. That'll happen again. And we'll have situations where the money is given out on a political basis. Another friend of mine did the study, looked at all in the $8 billion situation, looked at all of the money that was given out, and looked at the applications. And the law said, this money is for rural areas, it's for minorities, it's for the poor. That's what the money is for. And so my friend looked at the applications, what they said they were going to do, and then looked at who actually got the money, and found out that only one entity actually got money for serving a minority. Everything else, you could track, you could predict how the money was, where the money was going to go based upon the political party and based upon, did you have a congressman that was powerful in Washington, D.C.? That explained everything. And that's exactly what we will do now, because the way that it's being designed is that the money is going to be given to state politicians who then give it to local politicians. And you know that if you are someone who runs for political office, you cannot hold the local politician accountable for what they do. You can't do that because you need them for your campaigns. You can't criticize them in the papers and then say, hey, go get some voters for me. It doesn't work that way. And so I guess maybe a good way to summarize it, and you can tell I don't have a great tight answer for you on this one, David. To summarize it is to say, do you really want to put yourself in a situation where someone is going to be able to show that this money went to political friends and didn't give much broadband for anyone? Or would you rather be in a situation where you use the very best of economic models and use the money to get a lot of broadband expanded? Now, let me explain what I just meant. I'm giving you a very long answer.
Very good. So please keep it coming.
Yeah, the best practice around the world is something that happens in the Caribbean. It was pioneered by Chile and Peru. The United States started adopting it about 4 years ago. And it is to say, all right, we know there's some areas that don't have the broadband, and we can define what they are. And we will, before we do anything, let everybody know we don't think that area has broadband. If anyone can show us there's broadband there, tell us, and then we'll stay out. And sometimes people say, yeah, there's some broadband right there. You just missed it. Then it'll say, all right, so we now know the areas that need broadband, and we've got really smart engineers, we've got really smart economists. They're going to estimate how much it costs to provide service in that area. Now, we're going to say, if we're going to provide a subsidy, that's the goal here. We're going to provide a subsidy to serve that area. That means that we're going to put a limit on what can be charged for the retail price, because we're going to subsidize you. So you can't just charge anything you want to. There's a deal about how fast you roll out service and what you charge. And we'll estimate how much money we think that is. And then we'll have what we call a reverse auction, which means that if we think it costs $1,000 per customer to serve this, we'll say, okay, we'll provide no more than that. Would anybody do it for $950 per customer? And somebody, yeah, I'll do that. Okay, who will do it for $900? And you bid down the subsidy. And I don't remember the number, but it was something like the difference between what the FCC used to have to provide in subsidies and what it provides now under this system is like half. The amount of savings is tremendous. And so when I've talked with people around this city about what should be done, I say it's wonderful that you're able to arrive at some number that you think the subsidy should be. In their case, $65 billion. I said that's a really hard number to come up with, but it's a political number, and I get that. The question is, how are you going to get the most bang for your buck? And you can go through a political process of giving money out through grants and such as that, or you can use a system that is the best in the world. The FCC can run auctions better than anyone. They're amazingly good. And you will be able to get double or maybe 50% more broadband under that system than you will under the system that you're thinking about using. So that's what I encourage them to do. Now, there's a downside to that from a politician's perspective, because a politician needs votes. That's how we define success in politics. You get votes. Not that they're bad people. That's the incentive system that we set up for them. So they need to get credit for successes. It's hard if you're a politician to get success for a reverse auction. It's esoteric. Journalists don't understand it. Citizens don't understand it. Just doesn't look great. They get a lot of credit for grants because they can say, this is my friend. Look, you've got the check. You can be in front of a camera. You can show pictures of people digging and putting in fiber optics. It's great publicity. We need to figure out how to have a great reward system for the political arena to do these kind of esoteric, difficult things that are actually really productive as well. I don't have a good answer for that. It's one I'm trying to think about, though.
Thanks, Mark. I think you've really captured this the discussion well, and I'm sure that you've given a lot of food for thought for the region to think about that. And I completely agree with you. Governments just aren't very good at running businesses, and they will get into trouble. It will be more expensive at the end of the day. I want to pivot now, Mark. I want to talk about something that you mentioned earlier on. And frankly, a lot of it will seem to our audience like we're talking about American politics, but it's actually incredibly relevant to the Caribbean and Latin America because it's really about big tech and regulating, quote unquote, big tech and some of the implications of big tech. But before I get to that, there is a question that came through one of our audience members, and I'll share it with you. I'm not exactly sure, exactly what they mean, but I think you may have some insight into what they may be trying to get at. And the question is, can you speak to the impact of the pandemic on traditional approaches to regulating the telecoms industry?
Sure. And it's going to depend upon what you mean by traditional approaches. I got into this business back in 1984, before some of your audience was even born. So that makes me extremely boring or something. But I've got a lot of history. Back in those days, we treated telephone companies as public utilities. And so we went through this whole thing on rate of return regulation. And it was the companies would come to us and say, look, here's how much money I have spent. We would look at it and say, yeah, you're right, you did spend that much money. Okay, so now you can have prices that reflect that. And that was the system, and it's used a lot in the power sector all over the world. We don't call it that anymore, but that's effectively what was being done. So there's that approach. We learned over time that while that worked well as things were a monopoly, it had two problems. One is, you might notice how I described how the system worked, that we looked at the company's accounting records and say, yep, those numbers look right. And then the company got the money back. That didn't have much incentive to be really creative and innovative and cut costs. Not that people were bad. People tried to do good jobs, but there wasn't a penalty for not being as efficient as you could be, or investing more in trying to be efficient. And then we also started opening markets to competition, and it's hard to do this rate of return regulation when you have competition. So the next phase was something we called price cap regulation. And it came in lots of different flavors and lots of different scopes. But essentially it said, we're not going to pay attention to the actual amount the company spent. Instead, we're going to use other information to say, well, the price should be at this level. And if you do a really good job, you get to bump up your price a little bit. If you do a really poor job, it bumps down a little bit. So there's an incentive built into the system, and we're also deregulating as we go. So that's another kind of a traditional approach, if you will. More recently, all around the world, we've had a lot of deregulation of telecommunications. And so that is also now a tradition. So how does the pandemic affect it? I think in situations where we find ourselves with maybe only a single operator left. And I don't know of any place where that has happened, but it could. It could. I've looked at the finances of some companies and they don't look very good. I think the imperative is to go back to the imperatives we had about 20, 25 years ago. And that was to say, what is it about our regulations? What is it about the way government does business that makes it hard for someone to do this broadband, this ISP, this ICT business? What are the ways that we raise costs through licensing, permitting, regulatory delays, whatever it might be? And to get those as low as we can, so that if we do indeed lose an operator, someone can enter the market. We want to make entry as easy as we can. And so that is the first thing that I would be looking at. If we do indeed have situations where there's not going to be more than one, and maybe that's just a really small part of the geography, then we can fairly easily just benchmark what the prices might look like. So I think that's an opportunity as well. But it has to be consistent with, how do we subsidize areas that are not commercially viable? How do we actually design the incentives so the operators have every incentive to do a really good job, because monopolies don't tend to do a good job, whether they're government owned or privately owned. They tend to behave basically the same, except government's a little bit more expensive. So that's how I would answer the question. It depends on where in history you're looking, but just looking forward, I think those are kind of the keys. Let's get as much competition as we can by making sure that there are no barriers to entry. And if we can't, then we want to make sure we have a regulatory system in place that has all the incentives for expansion, growth, innovation. When we can get to, David, if you want to, issues of kind of getting into that net neutrality space, getting money not just from the customer, but from the other side of the market as well, because I think that's key too.
Sure, and why don't you share some of your thoughts on that? I do want. That's an important part of the conversation. We will move, in a few minutes to talking about, issues like privacy. Want to talk about Section 230 of the Decency Act, in the United States, and again touch on some U.S. politics, because it has implications, as I said, for the region. So I do want us to get into a little bit about that discussion about free speech and big tech. But the discussion, but the point that you raised about net neutrality rules is also, frankly, fundamental to the future of of the telecoms industry.
Right.
And the policy decisions that are made there will have a huge impact on investment. So I'm very curious to know your thoughts on that. And I think our audience also wants to understand where you think we're headed on that issue in a post-pandemic world.
Okay, great. So we've had some research. I'm an academic, so I'm going to talk about research, and then I'll get into the kind of the practical application. We've had research that has now been able to look at both how industry behaved with and without net neutrality, and how they thrived or did not through the pandemic, based upon what these rules were like. And we find that, as I alluded to back at the start, that the less regulatory control, the more investment, the more fiber optics, the more customers signed up for service than with the regulatory controls. And the reason is basically this. We have in broadband, and we have it all over the place in ICT, what we call two-sided, multi-sided markets, where really what the broadband does is brings people together. And you've got the consumer side of that, and then you've got what we call the edge side of that, or the content side of that, or it goes under a lot of different names, and it's quite diverse on the other side. These two groups want to be able to do stuff together, and the broadband is part of the platform for that. What people wanted to do with net neutrality was, in one part, keep the broadband providers from charging the edge for getting to the retail customers. Now, if you stop and think about that, what that then has to do, since you've got costs you have to cover, necessarily that drives up the prices for the consumer. So if you would allow the broadband providers to charge the edge for the access, now it turns out it's really hard to do, but if you allow it, then you actually get a more balanced market, and then the broadband providers able to say, I can now lower prices for the consumer side because I've got money flowing in from both sides, and I can get both sides even happier. Now, the edge providers would prefer not to have to do that. I think it's because they don't see what the end game actually looks like. So that's part of what goes on there in that. The other thing that the net neutrality stood in the way of, or stands in the way of if you have it, is allowing the broadband provider to go to an edge provider and say, you're competing against Facebook, you're competing against Google, you're competing against YouTube, and they've built their own fiber optic networks. So they connect very close to the customer. You can't do that, you're too small. So I can develop a special channel for you that is perfect for video, or perfect for search, or perfect for whatever it is you're wanting to do. And then you'll have just the same quality network that they do. And then you're better able to compete. Net neutrality says you're not allowed to do that. It says you have to treat everybody the same, which is fine if everybody was the same, but they're not. And so you want to be able to optimize. And so that's where net neutrality kind of gets in the way. Now let me talk about how we might be able to address that issue. So one of the things that I encourage people to think about is maybe using 5G as a good opportunity to implement something that where the network provider is more involved with the edge. Using your customized knowledge, not customized, your specialized knowledge of your own market situations, that you can design circuits that just adapt so well to them, because 5G is designed for that. It has what we call slicing, which means that we customize all those circuits, which net neutrality says don't you dare do that. But the technology in 5G does. So it's kind of becomes a moot point once you start moving into 5G. That should open up some good revenue opportunities for the broadband networks so that they can better serve both parts of the market. Now, that still leaves the issue, though, of can you really charge a Facebook for using a channel? Can you really charge a Google for using a channel? Because if you paid attention to the news in Australia, where the Australian government tried to put a tax on Google and Facebook, or maybe that was it. I don't remember who else was being involved, to subsidize journalists. Both of them said, well, fine, we just won't serve Australia. Now, eventually they got it worked out. But these companies have a lot of clout. If they say, well, we're just not going to serve Jamaica, Jamaicans will not be very happy with that. But there is something that's developing that may give you a solution. And I just had a meeting with the entrepreneurs working on this last week. And they're having their final big announcement on it in September in New York. It's I don't remember the name of the enterprise itself, but they call it Unfinished. Essentially what they're doing, and they have a billionaire backing them, so there's plenty of money for it. They've got it built. They're building a technology platform that's just as good as Google's, just as good as Facebook's, just as good as any of the big tech companies. And they're saying that if you would like to put an app on top of that to compete with any of these companies, go right ahead. There'll probably be a fee for it, but you don't have to build your own technology platform. You can use theirs. You don't have to go to big scale. It's kind of like you're doing, instead of saying, oh, no more net neutrality on the broadband, we're also doing the same thing within the platforms. No more kind of specialized platforms. We have a generic platform that anybody can build upon. They take care of the privacy issue because there's kind of one entry point for the customer. By one entry point, I mean that the customer signs up once for all the privacy constraints. They can change it. They can adapt it to any service provider they want. But they can also just use one and say, nobody gets to use my network, or excuse me, use my information for this. Or, yeah, the provider X gets to use my information, provider Y does not. Customers get to use that and do it on their own. So that has great promise, because why couldn't an operator, an ISP, broadband provider from the Caribbean say, I know the people here better than anyone. I am going to work with some people. We're going to develop a social media or search or whatever kind of app. We're going to put it on top of that platform. And then we have this rich information base on which we can do all of our data analytics and artificial intelligence, our machine learning that these other companies get to do. We will be able to exchange data with other ones as well. And since it's on our 5G network, we can specialize those channels so that we're giving our people a very customized experience. Will that all work? I don't know. They say they have the technology solved. The platform is actually functioning, working. They say they have it all worked out. And like I said, I've met the people, and they've been successful entrepreneurs several times. This is just their latest enterprise. And so I have confidence that they'll pull it off. Whether that becomes a viable business model is a whole nother matter. 90% of the people who try to enter the tech industry fail because business models are hard to do correctly. But there's some promise there. And perhaps that's something that people could jump on and perhaps use.
Thanks, Mark. Really fascinating look there at net neutrality, and there's a lot of food for thought. But what resonates for me is that your basic point about the fact that without sort of hard rules in place, broadband ultimately gets cheaper for the customer. Mm-hmm. I think that's for me the big takeaway about the net neutrality debate. I have to bring up something painful, and again to our audience, which is from the Caribbean, largely from the Caribbean and some Latin America. This may seem like a discussion, like I'm talking very much about American politics, but the fact is, as I've said, it's really sort of key to understanding the discussions that are going on today about big tech companies, I'd start by saying that the world was sort of stood in shock on January 6th when we saw in the United States the attack on the Capitol. We were just it's just unbelievable, the images that were being broadcast. We were just in utter shock. And yet at the same time, so much of it was was not a surprise. We could have seen it coming. And there are a number of issues that have come up, obviously that are around that event, but that have direct relevance for us in the field of technology and in discussion about the role that social media is playing in our lives, and the spread of quote unquote misinformation, and what role should regulation play in impacting speech. One of the things that came out of that event was deplatformed. Mm-hmm. We saw that Senator Josh Hawley was he ended up in a bit of a dispute with his publisher, which had canceled his contract to publish a book, and there has been a fairly significant discussion about Facebook's ban on Trump in particular, which was sort of not reinstated, but extended by its board. And you've written extensively in this area about the interplay of regulation and free speech and big tech. And I really want to get to share with our audience some of your thoughts on that. I think I want to start with something that an article you wrote, which I thought was really fascinating, which is that you made a very fundamental point, which is that users are losing trust in big tech. They're losing trust in social media companies. Mm-hmm. And you suggested that the reason for that was because a number of these companies are sort of blurring the lines between in the way they allow information to go out, to describe it very loosely, and the way that our societies have traditionally communicated in the past. I wonder if you could just explain a little bit about your thoughts on that, and then explain for the audience the implications as far as you see them for regulation of these big tech companies going forward.
Yeah. So the way that I've thought about it is I try to look at how do people naturally communicate together? How do we naturally develop relationships? And we have historically done that through kind of having meeting rooms where we'd be in control of who came to the meeting room, but once we were all there, we could kind of talk about and do whatever we wanted to. That was one type of communication that we were very used to. It goes back centuries. We would also have communications where one person could broadcast to a lot of people, but people could turn it off if they didn't want to hear it. And that was something else we were very used to. It may be, going back in a century, someone writes a book. If you don't like the book, you just don't read it. And then we also had private communications where you and I would talk together and everything we did was private in our communication. And those are kind of the basic ways that we've done it in the past. The big tech companies have blurred that, and people have responded rather poorly to it because with them, so if they don't like something you say, they kick you off the platform, and then suddenly you don't have a private communication. This is like losing your postal service. You lose your address. That's hard. Or they take away your cell phone. That's pretty tough as well. So they take away all the channels of communication if they don't like what you've done. And while I understand the point of that, because there are platforms that have failed because they've not done a good job of moderating what the nature of the communication would be, I get all of that, but I think they've not dissected their products well enough so that people can interact with them very naturally. I think there's a huge business opportunity there to say, okay, this is how humans really are. We don't really have one big community with 2 billion people on it. We have a lot of small communities, and we have lots of ways that we fracture and communicate even across those. So I think that's a fundamental mistake, and I think that's where a lot of the distrust comes, because once somebody says that, I'm going to remove your content, and somebody says, wait a minute, that's never been good in the past centuries, why is that good now? Then you start losing your trust. I've compared it in the past to a movie called The Truman Show. I don't know how many of you saw this particular movie. It's a Jim Carrey movie where he is going about his life, and suddenly a camera or a light falls out of the sky, and he discovers he's just on a TV show. And people have been spying on him all this time, and that's how people suddenly felt when the revelations came about Cambridge Analytica, etc. So we've lost a lot of trust in these particular entities. What I think, though, that's led to is when the companies actually deplatformed Trump, is then everybody saw that these companies were powerful enough to cut off the communications for what was the most powerful politician in the world. And that was a great lesson for people around the world. Because if you're a politician, you want to make sure that never happens to you. But you also want to be able to use that power to your advantage. And so if you watch what is going on in the town I'm in now, Washington, D.C., you'll see a lot of politicians grabbing that power and wanting to use it for themselves. They say, all right, so let's put a lot of pressure on Mr. Zuckerberg. Let's put a lot of pressure on any of the other CEOs, that if they don't deal with what I call misinformation, other people may not call it that, but I call it misinformation, or I call it being divisive. If they don't deal with that, I'm going to deal with them. I'm going to break them up. All the pieces are put in place to do that, or I'm going to tax them more heavily. All the pieces are put in place for that. And so it's a way of pushing these platforms to be your political ally. That's not going to go well. That's not going to go well for their business models. It's not going to go well for how well that economy works. What I encourage people to think about is understand that there's a difference between competition between platforms and having politics competing on the platforms. When you have competition between platforms, I expect the competition to roll out over time. Google and Facebook compete for people's attention. They compete for who does what kinds of information provision. Twitter gets into that space as well. Instagram gets into that space. TikTok gets into that space. So you see a lot of them kind of moving into each other's space. No one's a direct substitute for the other, but they are doing a lot of competition. But that takes time. In the political arena, competition does not have time. As you approach an election, if a platform intervenes in the communication, there is no time for all of the people who are trying to go through all their political communications to switch to another platform and say, okay, let's just all go over to TikTok, we'll do it there, or let's all go over and we'll start our own platform. That's physically impossible. So I think there's a difference in how we have to treat political discussions than we do others, more our commercial side, our social side. And I think about it this way, and I've not fleshed this out to any great degree. And that is the way I would want a country to try to approach it is to work with the various platforms and say, okay, our candidates, our political actors, our voters, all want to be able to communicate on your platform as we approach this election. And there are going to be special rules for it. That there could be boundaries on who hears what. So that, a politician maybe isn't, if they're saying something that offends people, they're not saying it in front of everybody. It's just only the people who said, yeah, I want to listen. But the politician doesn't get deplatformed just because they do something that the platform says, you can't say those kinds of things on our platform. Well, they're in a meeting room. And everybody in the meeting room has agreed they want to hear this because they want to understand. how this person thinks and how they behave under pressure. And so you have these special channels set up in the political space so that we don't have the deplatforming issues, because all of our countries depend upon good communications to be able to have our political discussions. And I'm an American. I've spent all my life here, so I have a particular view of free speech. I admit that. But I've also done a lot of studies of it. As I've studied leadership, as I work with Araceli on leadership issues, I've had a lot of reasons to study how the mind works. And it turns out that free speech is really important for three basic reasons. One is there is competition amongst ideas. And generally, if you try to censor an idea because you think it's bad, sometimes you're going to censor out the idea that's really critical, that people really need to struggle with. Every great idea started out as a radical idea. Not all radical ideas become great, but every one of them started out as a radical idea. So we don't want to push radical ideas away. We want to give them a chance in the marketplace of ideas. We also, our minds just simply need to struggle with really difficult concepts, controversial concepts, things that make us uncomfortable, because that's the way our minds grow, and that's the way our minds get shaped to be able to deal with more controversial ideas and things that come along around the world. The previous panel was talking about how hard it is to be a parent in these days. And part of it, I don't think they were talking about this in particular, is all the information that's thrown at kids and how hard it becomes to be a parent. And actually, I think of it this way. If God wanted each of us to grow up in a perfect environment, each of us would have about 2,000 kids. We just practice till we got it right. But we don't. We have 1, 2, or 3. And it's because our idea of perfect, this kind of very comfortable world is wrong. It should not be that way. We should struggle with very difficult situations for our own mental development. And then the third reason is for our own social development. A society can sustain itself only if it knows how to deal with really radical situations, really difficult, controversial ideas, people that we strongly disagree with. That's the only way we are an adaptive society. If we lock ourselves in to a particular set of discussions and you can't exceed these boundaries, our society wouldn't last more than a few generations.
Yeah. You know, Mark, you've spoken very eloquently, I think, about the value of free speech and why it's such an important principle. And in the context of, Caribbean and Latin American politics, it's a very, very important discussion, because from a regional perspective, the concern that, and it's actually a very well-made point, the concern that many of our governments would have is that many of our citizens are on Facebook, they're using WhatsApp, they're using Twitter, they're using social media. Our citizens are there, and these platforms and political activism is very strong on these platforms as well. We just had elections in St. Lucia, where I'm based, on Monday, and social media played an incredible role in that election, as it has in all the elections in the Caribbean. And what I hear you saying is, as much as it is as much as certain thoughts and certain points of view may be offensive or dangerous, we have to be very careful about creating an environment in which we block or suppress certain types of speech, because in some cases it may be speech we want to hear, or speech that may actually be helpful to the society. So a balance has to be achieved. But I want to bring the discussion down a little bit now to a bit of the specifics about the implications of everything that's been going on in the United States for regulation of social media, basically. Mm-hmm. And there's been you've written on it, you've spoken very eloquently on it, and there's a raging debate in the United States about, obviously that was prompted by the platforming of Trump, etc., and it had been going on before, but and it centers around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the discussion. And I want you to explain to our audience, first of all, what Section 230 means. And then I want to have a very quick discussion with you about whether that section needs to be reformed. And if it needs to be reformed, how should it be reformed? Or whether we should leave it alone.
Yeah, well, that section has two parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
One is it says, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'll get the language wrong, and so just forgive me. I'm an economist. There's only so many things I can do.
It's okay. Sounds like me with numbers.
So one part of it says that if you are an interactive computer service, and this is back in the days of computer bulletin boards and CompuServe and all this, is way before anybody ever thought of a Facebook. It says if you're an interactive computer service, you are not liable for what other people say. And so if David Cox says something completely horrible on Facebook, you may be able to go after David Cox if he has done something that's illegal, but you can't go after Facebook for that because they just simply served as a platform. It's not their content. The other part is that the companies are required to not keep content that is illegal, human trafficking, things like that. They're not allowed to keep that, but they can also moderate content as they see fit that is otherwise offensive. As long as they do that, I don't remember the exact phrase, but
on a voluntary or in good basis or in good faith basis.
In good faith, that's the phrase. In good
and
faith.
Just so that we connect the dots for our audience, we're saying that Facebook and other companies were able to deplatform Trump because under U.S. law they have that protection. They basically can moderate themselves, so they're regulating themselves basically.
Yeah. Now there is a lawsuit that Trump has, where he says that you can't do this. You should not have done that to me, because you did it at the behest of politicians, which made you a state actor, and you censored me, and so you acted on behalf of government to censor me, and that's not legal, and that is true. Whether Facebook really did that or Twitter really did that on the behest of politicians is a fact issue that they'll have to sort out. I have written that I don't think that lawsuit will go anywhere, but at some point one of those will probably hit. Anyway, so that's the question is, will those kind of protections stand? I don't think they will. I don't know that someone will rewrite that part of the Communications Act. There's a lot of efforts to do it. It's hard to do well. And so they may wear themselves out on other things and not get to it. The courts will probably start treating it differently. Clarence Thomas, one of our justices in the Supreme Court, has laid out problems he sees with how courts have interpreted that. He thinks that the interpretation has been too generous. And so at least courts will at some point, I think, start pushing back. Whether we get a different law may be a whole nother matter.
But I think the question is, are these companies, does that section of the law give these companies too much power? So, just to put things in context, there's an argument to be made that provision actually has helped innovation on the internet, right? I mean, just imagine if tech companies like Google and Facebook didn't have that, and other startups didn't have that protection, it meant every time that some company wanted to, have some social media, I mean, just imagine if you had a video on YouTube and you said something that was defamatory, or you said something that was just completely wrong, and somebody could sue YouTube because somebody was providing medical information that was just completely misleading or untrue, the company wouldn't exist. Right. So the fact that that law exists has actually led to the very innovation that we've seen, and frankly we're all benefiting from. I think the question is it the case that companies like YouTube, like Google, like Facebook are now too powerful because the decisions about whether or not somebody should be allowed to communicate or not is being left entirely to them. And then there's for instance, you criticized in an article, you criticized Facebook for its decision to extend the ban on Trump.
Yes.
You know, with context, of course. But I guess, Mark, the bottom line is, are these companies too big? And is this a problem which requires regulation? Does it require intervention by, I mean, you mentioned the courts, but I'm specifically asking, is it time now for governments around the world to think about regulation in this area?
Yeah. No, I think that would be a bad idea. So one, let me just talk about, they're big, and that is true. Their size is, I don't know, fairly unprecedented, at least in modern times. But every Facebook user is someone who said, my life is better off with Facebook than without it. Every person who uses Google search says, my life is better off searching with Google in this moment than Bing or Yahoo or someone else. These are all big because we choose them to be big because we think they do a better job for us. And if we want to regulate them, all we do is make them worse. We break them up. All we do is deny customers the services they want. So it's really tough to say that that their bigness is a bad thing, because we're saying no. It's one by one. It's good for us. What I think and the reason I think regulation, trying to regulate it, would be a problem is because exactly what we're seeing in this town, and that is the regulation that we hear the politicians aspiring to would be used to make the platforms even more political, to make them a good political tool for one side or the other. And I think that's the last thing we want. We really do want a large open debate, because that's how we're going to grow best as societies. That's how we're going to grow best as people in a modern age. It's how we're going to be able to figure out what are the good ideas or the bad ideas. I heard a professor one time, and I really admired her for saying this. A student asked her, I see you're really smart. You know all the right things. What book should I read so I know what you know? She said, read everything, because you have to know what a lie sounds like. And I think that's exactly right. We need to know. And we don't know if somebody protects us from it.
Okay, Mark, I think that's a really interesting perspective. But I do want to push back a little bit, and then this is going to be my last couple of questions. What about privacy, though? I mean, what about the fact that these companies have so much information? And again, I'm not trying to make sort of stick my eye at anyone.
Yeah.
But it is an important discussion for us to have. Lots of these companies have a huge amount of information about their customers, etc. And we found out, unfortunately, you've written about this extensively, that some of that information has been shared without, users' knowledge or their consent or awareness. Isn't that an area you think that there's room and a need for intervention?
I don't know what the intervention would exactly look like, other than to hold the companies accountable for, not a lawyer, but what I would consider to be consumer fraud. If you gather information that you've told me you're not gathering, if you share information that you've assured me you're not sharing, any other business arrangement, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. I don't know why we would allow these companies to do that as well. And if they've written their terms and conditions so complicated that nobody can read them, well, we've dealt with that problem before as well. And we've required plain language agreements between contracting parties, et cetera. So I'd rather see something like that dealing with the privacy issues. And just to...
Sorry, so you're saying this should be a private remedy rather than an area for government to try to get involved in?
No, I think the laws we have in place are probably quite adequate, because we've dealt this. It's like I said, it's just not telling your customers the truth. And we know how to deal with that. So I think we can. I think we can deal with it in this situation as well. There is the issue of the big data. They got so much data. You've heard the statement, data is the new oil, that kind of a thing. One is I encourage people to go look up unfinished.com. They have what they would consider to be a solution to that. And it's a marketplace-based solution. I think it's a good approach for it. Another thing to remember is that our artificial intelligence that all these companies are really good at is really, really weak. And the example I use to illustrate the point is, all of you probably noted a few years ago, it wasn't that long ago actually, that the AlphaGo computer beat the world champion Go player, right? Go is an incredibly complicated game, requires lots and lots of skill and capability. So AlphaGo finally beat it. It was a computer developed by Google. In order to beat the world champion, the AlphaGo computer had to burn 170 kilowatts of electricity and had to play millions of games. The world champion had probably played about 200,000 or 300,000 games in his entire life, and his mental energy exerted was about 6 watts, so about 1/50,000th of the amount of energy consumed by the computer. So the computer could do a lot, but it's not very smart compared to the human mind. So whoever taps the next layer in artificial intelligence of what a human mind can do is going to beat everybody that's relying upon our current state of artificial intelligence.
Mark, it's been a fascinating discussion. Frankly, I could go on for another hour, but I just want to thank you so much for your time. I think the discussion has been incredibly interesting, and we really are interested in hearing more of your thoughts about some of the research that you've done. I want to thank you again, and I'd just like to give you an opportunity to, share any last thoughts that you have on where you think we're going to end up on any of these issues, whether it's broadband, it's connectivity, on the tech industry, moving into 2022 and beyond.
Sure, and just it's really short. We're not going to end up anywhere. We're going to keep moving down a path, and we're all going to be surprised at where the path goes, but we're going to keep moving down it. And I am just honored that I get to work with all of you, because you're the people that make things happen. All I do is talk about it and write about it. You actually do the real work, and so it's an honor to be part of your lives. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much.